Thank you everyone for joining today. I'm really excited to be here today to talk with you about the topic of navigating relationships while living with chronic pain and illness. Before I dive in, I thought I would share a little more about me before I get into the meat of it. I've been living with chronic pain and illness for a long time, since my teens. So this is something that I've been dealing with and thinking about a lot over the years. I've been married, I've been divorced, I've had some long-term relationships, and all of that through various periods of health ups and downs. I've also had times where I've chosen to be on my own and not in a relationship. And I think those periods where I've chosen to be on my own are really a reflection of just how hard it is to manage your symptoms and be able to show up for your partner and tolerate or manage your partner's reactions and responses to your health issues. This is really hard stuff. And I find that the resources and information out there, while they're improving, they're still pretty limited and lacking for specifically people in our types of situations with this type of health issue. And it's part of the reason why I like doing these presentations and why I wrote my book, which I am updating, and there'll be a revised version coming out early next year. So we're covering a lot of information today. It's a really dense topic and hard to squeeze into an hour. I've got a lot to share, so let's get started. So let's start by taking a look at some of the things you might be experiencing. I put together this mind map, which is by no means exhaustive, but it shows a lot of the extra layers we're dealing with when we have a chronic condition and a relationship. And if this looks overwhelming, scary, stressful, confusing, that's because it is. Out of fairness, this is hard. And if this looks familiar, you're not alone. Having a relationship with chronic pain and illness can bring about a lot of different issues. And some of the main ones I've identified are unexpected and unwanted lifestyle adjustments, grief, a lot of worry about being a burden, not feeling understood by your partner. Pre-existing problems in the relationship might become more apparent when the illness arises. And sometimes having a conversation about these changes and unwanted lifestyle adjustments and all the worries can be really difficult and can lead to other issues like withdrawing or increased arguments. And if we follow the lines from all of these mind map routes, really we end up with a lot of difficult emotions. And if we can ease some of these hard emotions, reduce some of the unhelpful thoughts like I'm a burden, and reduce some of the unhelpful behaviors we might be engaging in, like overfunctioning, that can go a long way to helping our relationships. So this topic, even this mind map, might bring up a lot of feelings: overwhelm, fear, dread, hopelessness, might even bring up some guilt or inadequacy or shame. And of course it would. How could it not? I think anyone in our situation, in this situation, would feel that way and have some of these feelings really normal. So this is our starting point today. Chaotic, messy, scary. We're going to look at how to bring some balance and calm to this picture. There are things you can do to mitigate the hard times and the difficult emotions, which is what we're going to talk about today. So by the end of the hour, you'll have some idea of how to break this down into manageable pieces and how to start working on the things that you can do to impact and improve, nurture, and maintain your relationship, all while staying in your energy envelope or training zone, or whatever term you like, that indicates that you're functioning okay and you're not pushing too hard. So when you first become sick, it's not unusual for your partner to be empathetic and supportive and willing to help. That'd be really, really common. Often you might both believe that this is something temporary that can be resolved. But when acute conditions become chronic, and especially if it's been difficult to get a diagnosis, there's no end in sight, problems start to arise. And some of the common statements I hear from clients who are in relationships and facing their chronic conditions include, I'm too much of a burden for my partner. I'm holding them back. Things are going to fall apart because I can't keep up my end of the relationship. We can't be happy or have a fulfilling relationship if I'm sick. I should break up with them because I can't manage both the relationship and my illness. My partner is going to leave me because of my illness. So when illness and pain don't resolve, your relationship might start to feel a little less solid, and you may start to experience fear that your partner will leave. Or perhaps you contemplate leaving yourself because you believe it would be easier on both of you. And these would all be really understandable responses in this case. And again, if that's you, you're not alone in this. I know I've had all of those thoughts, at least at some point in my life, if not many times. And that's why we're here today. And just on a side note, all of this relationship stress and uncertainty comes on top of you grieving your own losses and adjusting to what's happening in your body now. So, and I like to say this a lot, out of fairness, this is hard. So when you make a commitment to your partner, whether through marriage or cohabitation or otherwise, there's often a specific or implied message of we're going through this together in sickness and in health. But I don't know how many of us consider the sickness might come in the form of a chronic condition with no end date, particularly if we're still young or relatively young. I think we envision taking care of our partner later in life when we're in our retirement years, or perhaps at a younger age, but we're going through something acute like a bad flu or an injury. When I got married myself, having sickness mean a chronic condition that started at a young age and didn't have an end date hadn't even crossed my mind as a possibility. So I never expected the health problems I had at the time I got married to continue, let alone worsen. I also had no idea just how much my condition would impact my partners over the years, and that was hard for me to understand. So there were just so many unknowns at each step and every turn, and this is the difficulty and the reality of chronic health issues. So let's talk a little bit more about how illness impacts relationships. First of all, there can be significant differences in relationship outcomes depending on which partner becomes ill. Studies have been done on divorce rates in couples where illness arises, but most of these studies have been focusing on cancer and MS. So we have less information, or not really a lot at all, about this sort of conditions that we're looking at in risk groups. Also, these studies focus mostly on heterosexual relationships, so there are limitations in the information we have there as well. And in addition, I'm a cisgendered heterosexual white female, so my personal experience is limited to this view. And I just wanted to let that be known. So let's look at what the studies tell us. When partners leave a relationship due to illness, it's more often men that leave and not women. According to a 2009 study published in the journal Cancer, the divorce rate was 21% for seriously ill women and 3% for seriously ill men. So the control group divorced at 12%. So this suggests that if the disease makes husbands more likely to leave, it makes wives more likely to stay, which is interesting. And there seems to be a difference in the marriage relationship outcomes for same-sex relationships. So overall findings suggest that same-sex couples may experience less stress around illness and caregiving and be more likely to receive the kind of care they desire, regardless of the gender. But more details really aren't readily available, so we're limited there too. And that's the what of what's happening, but let's look at why this is occurring. When one partner becomes ill, the other one will generally, at least at first, take over and do some caretaking. But this is where things start to become tricky. All caregivers are not created equal, and a lot of this has to do with sociocultural influences. The first one being gendered expectations. So when relationships are affected by serious illness, it can bring existing gender inequalities to the surface. We think we've come a long way with these gendered expectations about household work and caregiving, but in reality, a lot of that still rests on women. Women are the ones who primarily maintain the home and family still. Obviously, there are exceptions, but generally when a woman gets sick, it can really reveal the extent to which men feel entitled or used to a certain level of household and housework. But they may also have no concept of how to be an efficient or effective caregiver because men haven't learned how or had to be. And another thing that men and women interpret what caregiving looks like very differently. Men and women interpret what caregiving looks like very differently. Men view illness is something to fix, a problem to be solved. They're more able to attend to acute things like taking you to a doctor's appointment or the emergency room, urgent visits, picking up prescriptions, but they struggle with other caregiving tasks like emotional support and housework and childcare, sort of the ongoing daily tasks that aren't solvable problems. So this means that women often continue to do more than they're able to in those areas. Sometimes we overcompensate out of guilt, obligation, or because we feel like a burden, so we feel like we need to work harder. And when we can't or we don't continue with these tasks, problems start to arise and conflict comes about. So women also continue to provide a significant emotional support to their male partners, even though they themselves are sick. And women may not also be receiving that same emotional support in return. Then we have family and societal myths and cultural expectations. So these gendered expectations that we just discussed are influenced by family, society, and the culture we live in. You know, we hear messages like, oh, men just aren't good at housework and men aren't as good at taking care of the kids. I don't know. I've certainly heard men refer to taking care of their own kids as babysitting. And, you know, I think that just goes to show that that's part of our culture. It's changing, but I still hear it happen. These have been our cultural messages, and caregiving is still often seen as women's work. I know, you know, when my mom died, I was about 20 years old and I was in university, I was starting my own life, and my aunt asked, oh, will you be taking care of your father now? You know, with the message that, oh, a man needs a caretaker. Meanwhile, he'd been taking care of me and my mother up until then. But it was just interesting to me that my aunt assumed that he would need a woman to take care of him after my mom had died. So just an example of how that shows up in our day-to-day life. Women are simply expected to do this work, while men receive much more recognition and appreciation for caregiving they do. And they're more likely to be let off the hook when they decide maybe it's too much or they can't manage it. So research shows that men benefit hugely from female caregiving. And women are also socialized into believing that they must be caregivers and sometimes don't see another option. But please, I'm not here to bash men. These are simply expectations and patterns we've been living with and we're conditioned to. There are always exceptions to this, but these patterns become a real obstacle when it comes to women having chronic health issues and trying to maintain relationships. Another influence on caretaking is social isolation. So a man typically relies on his partner as his main confidant, his best friend. And when his partner's sick, he can find himself in a downward spiral of isolation. His job of caregiving grows even tougher in the absence of previous emotional support that he used to get from his partner. So whereas women may tend to turn to friends and family, support groups, counselors for help, men tend not to do this, which furthers their feelings of isolation. We have the stress. Men may be less equipped to handle and tolerate the emotional pain and frustration that comes with the situation. Many men never learned the tools for emotional regulation, and they're more likely to repress or avoid difficult feelings. And this becomes more evident in stressful situations. Caregivers tend to be 6 times more likely to be depressed than partners who don't need to be caregivers. And this highlights the importance of self-care for caregivers, which is something we'll address later on as well. And finally, the financial issues. Demands of a partner's illness can interfere with one's ability to earn a living. You know, you may not be able to work as much if you're caring for your partner. You may miss work. And this might be harder for a man to accept than a woman. So, you know, essentially, we're not only facing our pain and illness, but we're up against some very long-standing sociocultural expectations and beliefs about the woman's role in her relationship. So this is not just you and your partner. This is a sociocultural issue as well. And out of fairness, this is hard. But let's move away from the hard truths for a moment and look at some positives. Studies found that the longer the marriage, the more likely it would remain intact or stable. And partners who are able to band together to fight an illness report increased closeness. They view themselves as co-survivors. This comes from studies on cancer, I think we might be able to extrapolate from that a bit anyway. Some relationships do become stronger when there's illness because they feel they've faced or are facing the challenge together. So far, we've looked at the challenges that relationships face when there's chronic illness. Let's now look at what we can do to support our relationships through these difficult times. This is the how to manage them. Can the relationship do more than just survive, but also adapt and grow? And yes, I believe it can. And there are two ways to support your relationship. One is to work on yourself, and the other is to work on your relationship. So let's start with working on self. You really can't go wrong by putting in the work with yourself. It's the best thing you can do for your relationship, any relationship for that matter. Making peace with yourself helps you show up as the best version of you with your partner. And the more at peace you are with yourself, the more regulated your nervous system and your emotions, and the more likely that your relationship and your health will improve. So the first thing I want to start with is talking a little bit about what sort of patterns we might be in as people with chronic pain and illness. And I do see a pattern emerging quite strongly in my clients and in myself. So this is the spectrum of human behavior, and we're just going to look at different types of human behavior for a moment. The first one is called other determined behavior. And this is exactly what it sounds like. If I'm other determined, my behavior is determined by other people. Before I do anything, I'm going to look to other people to decide what I'm going to do next. And my motivation is that I want people to be happy, I want them to like me, and I don't want there to be conflict. So I might be considered a giver. I give a lot at this end. I'm a people pleaser. I have a high degree of empathy. I really feel other people's feelings. I care a lot about other people. I put others before myself, to my detriment quite often. My self-care might be low. I avoid conflict. At the extreme end, I have poor boundaries. I find it really hard to say no. I'm a peacekeeper, a caretaker. My self-worth may be quite low, which leads all of this to exhaustion and resentment eventually, even in the healthiest of people. And that resentment might sound like, I take so much time caring for everyone else. I do so much for everyone else, but no one's there to look after me. Then if we look at the other end of the spectrum, the self-determined behavior, here we have the opposite of the other determined. This is, if I'm at this end of the spectrum, my behavior is determined by me looking to myself to decide, how am I going to behave? So if I'm in a good mood, great. The people around me are probably going to be happy or at least relieved. But if I'm not in a good mood, look out, because I'm not going to be pleasurable to be around. And I'm going to be looking for other people to help me feel better. So I'm a taker. I will take from others. I have a low level of empathy. People might call me selfish. I consider really just myself. And conflict, I'm okay with it if it comes out in the outcome I desire. And so let's take a look at the middle. The middle is the goal. This is balanced self-determinism. And these are a bit of a mouthful. You don't have to remember the specific terms. But we want to aim for balanced self-determinism. And what does that look like? That means putting yourself first before helping others, having good self-care, developing an ability to self-soothe and regulate your emotions and your nervous system, having healthy boundaries. So being able to say no, being able to be firm, but also kind, good communication, conflict management skills, strong sense of self-worth, lots of self-compassion. And there's still room to have compassion for others and do things for others, as long as you've taken care of yourself first. And I find that most, if not all, of the people I work with who have chronic health conditions are at the other determined end of the spectrum, and different areas between other determined and balanced. The goal is to work towards being more in the middle, that balanced place. Being more in the middle will benefit you and your relationship. And it might seem a little counterintuitive at first if you spent a lot of time down at the far end of other determined. So let's talk a little bit about how to get towards the middle. I'm going to share some tools and ideas with you right now for that, because the more you are in the middle, the better that's going to benefit you, your health, and your relationship. So when we're living with chronic pain and illness, we really experience a roller coaster of difficult emotions. And they're all valid emotions, regardless of about how you might feel of them or what anyone else says about them. Based on what others have told you, you might believe your emotions are too much or that you're too sensitive. But emotions are who we are, and they're all too often invalidated by the outside world, but also by ourselves, especially if we've learned that maybe we think we shouldn't be feeling this way. And now is the time to change that. Befriending, accepting, and taking care of your emotions is key. If you're able to validate your emotions yourself, rather than relying on your partner to do this, you're going to be in a much better position. Validating your emotions will soothe you and calm your nervous system. And being able to take care of yourself within your relationship will help you with your interactions with your partner. So let's look at this first tool. I love this tool. Identify, accept, validate. It's a powerful way to befriend, accept, and take care of your emotions. So I'm going to go through this with an example. It's a 3-step tool. And the first step is to identify the emotion you're feeling and label it. So I'm going to use sort of a scenario. For example, let's say I just got a new diagnosis, and on top of the 8 I already have. And I'm feeling really scared and anxious to have another diagnosis. So the first step is really just to identify and say, yeah, I feel scared and anxious. The second step is to accept that I'm feeling scared and anxious. And this involves noticing in your body where you're feeling the emotions and what those sensations are. So if I'm feeling scared and anxious, I feel a tightness in my chest. Maybe there's like a racy feeling and it's kind of going up my throat. And what I want to do is radically accept that this is what I'm feeling in my body right now. And what that means is I'm not approving of it, and I'm not saying it's going to last forever. I'm just accepting the facts of the matter and saying, yeah, these are the sensations in my body right now. And these sensations are what scared and anxious feel like to me. So this is what's happening. We're just accepting that this is the body's experience. And the third step is to validate what you're feeling within the context of your experience. So that would mean, yeah, it makes sense that I'm feeling scared and anxious, given that I've just got a diagnosis and I already have 8. That's a lot. Anyone else in my shoes would feel that way. So it's important to validate it in the context of your experience, because it will always be valid. It may not make sense if I say to someone, oh, I just got a diagnosis of, let's say, something mild, like I have a wart on my toe. And I'm thinking, but having another diagnosis has just put me in this highly scared place because I'm so overwhelmed with all my other ones. If someone had said to me, oh, I have a wart on my toe, most people would say, well, why are you scared and anxious? It doesn't make sense. But within the context of your experience, if you're already struggling so much with your health, having one more thing piled up on top of that, then it really makes sense. So it's important to include the context in your validation. And I'm providing a whole lot of handouts for you after today. And this tool is going to be included in the handouts. So you'll have the formula for this. Okay, so we have the identify, accept, validate tool. The next piece is radical acceptance. So I referred to that within that previous tool, but let's talk about it a little more because I really like radical acceptance. It can be really helpful, not just when it comes to emotions, but also situations, your illness, and your partner. What it means is you're simply accepting the facts of the situation as they are. You're not wishing they were different. You're not trying to ignore them or deny them or try to push them away. We're simply acknowledging what is. So that might sound something like, I have a chronic health condition and my partner and I are arguing more than before I became sick. Just the facts. This is my starting point. And we want to do this because we don't want to wait to get to a better place to do something about our challenges. We don't want to say, oh, when I feel better, then I'll do this. We want to say, this is where it's at. This is my starting point. Now what? Changing requires acceptance first, and not accepting leads to more suffering. So we're actually reducing suffering by acceptance. The next one, I'm a huge fan of self-compassion, and even just simply the phrase, out of fairness, this is hard. Compassion regulates emotions and the nervous system. And it's important we have compassion for how hard the situation is to be in a relationship with chronic pain and illness, because it is hard. The next thing you can do to work on yourself is set boundaries. It's really important that you're not pushing yourself to still do things that your partner previously expected of you if it's too much for you, like caregiving and chores. It's time to start over-functioning, or sorry, the opposite. It's time to stop over-functioning and to start saying no. And this is a lot easier said than done. I understand feeling like you have to do whatever you can not to be a burden or to make your partner stick around. So setting boundaries may seem counterintuitive, but your health must come first. Please don't sacrifice yourself for your relationship. And the key with boundaries is we can't rely on others to remember them and adhere to them. It's up to us to set, maintain, and enforce them. And I like to say even these boundaries are for myself, even though they involve someone else. I need to be accountable when it comes to maintaining them. I can't rely on anyone else to remember and adhere to them consistently. The consistency is up to me, so that if someone's not sticking to them, I can say, hey, remember that thing I asked you for? Would you be willing to do that? The next one is asking for your needs to be met. So all of these things are struggles we have when we're at that other determined end of the spectrum. So we all have needs, but sometimes we feel like we're not allowed to have them, especially if they're inconvenient for other people. Feeling like you're not allowed to have needs is, really common for people pleasers. So I'm going to be providing a tool later on in the work on the relationship section called a feedback formula, which you can use in order to ask for your needs to be met. I can't tell you how much I love this book, The Art of Extreme Self-Care by Cheryl Richardson. She actually has a chapter called Let Me Disappoint You, and it's all about learning how to be okay with disappointing others. She talks about being willing to let go of your high standards and give yourself permission to put yourself first and not take any care of anyone else for now. It's a really easy read. It's not a dense book, and I've listed it in the resources, so that's one of my favorites. Strengthen your support system outside your relationship. So maybe you already have a great support system, but maybe you're feeling a lack. So I like to suggest creating a written inventory of those people who support you or could support you. Friends, family, pets, professionals, community, and then lean on them when you need to, rather than putting more on your partner. And maybe you already do this and it's just a good reminder, but I always say, when would be a better time to ask for some help than right now? You need it right now. This is the time. Another thing I think is really important in terms of working on yourself, it has been such a game changer for me personally, is doing a neuroscience-based brain rewiring program. This is really the most powerful thing you can do for yourself. There are many out there, and these are just some examples: the dynamic neural retraining system, the Gupta program. There's Curable. Curable's just for pain, but the other ones include illness. And I know Rick also includes a lot of these principles in his work in groups. I've done DNRS, and I know many other people who have as well, and every one of them experienced at least some degree of physical symptom relief, if not huge relief, which then is a great way, like it just makes relationships so much easier when we're not struggling with so much discomfort and pain and distress. I think everyone I know who's done those programs have also experienced significant personal and spiritual development and growth. The programs help reduce symptoms and move you more towards that middle place on the spectrum. And then finally, healing unresolved wounds and trauma. So this is not the place to start. I really don't recommend working on this if your symptoms are moderate to severe. But once your nervous system's calmer and you've developed the skill of self-soothing or completed a program like DNRS or Gupta, addressing your past traumas and wounds with a counselor in a safe way when the time is right can go a long way to supporting yourself and your relationship. But again, we really don't want to do this if it's going to be dysregulating to the nervous system, because it can worsen symptoms. Okay, so this is a long list of ideas, and I think of it as a buffet. Try one or two things that sound really interesting, see what you like, and leave the rest. even just doing one of these things will make a difference. These things will benefit not only you, but your relationship, and they're only going to benefit you, even if the relationship doesn't last. These are things you'll always be able to take with you. And the more at peace you are with yourself, the more your nervous system and emotions are regulated, and you're in that balanced place, the more that you'll help your health and your relationship. This is about finding ways to take the pressure off yourself. Okay, so that was a big piece on self. Now we're going to talk about working on your relationship. Quite often, difficulties in relationships are not necessarily about the apparent problems at hand, but more about, one, how we communicate about the problem, and two, how each partner is managing their emotions around the issue. So according to psychologist and relationship expert, Dr. John Gottman, more than 70% of problems in relationships are not resolvable. That's a high number. The first time I heard that, I barely believe it. Well, what this means is we want to focus on what is resolvable, that 30%. We want to work on resolving that, but we want to learn how to talk about the 70% that's not resolvable so we can have an open dialogue about it. And that being said, we do need a willing partner. We can do all the work in the world, but if our partner isn't on board, at least for part of the way, we can't do it for the both of us. It can be really tempting to try. And if you're on that other determined end of the spectrum, you probably already have tried to do some of the work on your partner's behalf. I know I've done a lot of that. But both partners need to be willing to show up and do some work. And this may be a hard truth and an opportunity for radical acceptance. You know, I've been in a situation in 2 long-term relationships where my partners just weren't willing. And I tried for the both of us for a really long time until I realized that I just couldn't do their part for them. And that was tough to come to terms to that. If your partner is unwilling at this time, I highly recommend a book actually called It Takes One to Tango by Winifred Riley. It's also in the resources. It sort of gives you an idea of what you can do on your own without doing your partner's share. I think it's a great read if you don't have a partner who wants to do the work with you. So coming back to the image here, I've identified 3 areas to work on when it comes to your relationship: communication, emotion and nervous system regulation, and strengthening your friendship and bond. So let's start by looking at communication. Banding together involves being able to communicate and work together. 2 people brainstorming like a seemingly unsolvable problem is a lot more helpful than not doing it at all. We need to have ongoing conversations with our partner to understand how we're both feeling and to understand what we both want and need from the relationship. Relationships don't stay the same, so we need to keep talking about changing challenges, emotions, needs, wants, and desires. This is tough, and how we communicate, though, is really key. So John Gottman, who I mentioned earlier, has identified the behaviors that are the most damaging to relationships, which he calls the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And those behaviors are criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. Stonewalling is also known as the silent treatment. Focusing on reducing these behaviors is a great starting point for improving communication. I'm not going to delve too much more into each of these, but you can take a little quiz on his website and find out more about what your and your partner's 4 horsemen are. I've also included a link to his website with that quiz in the resources, so you can do that on your own time. And once you've identified your horsemen, I do have some tools for that. So let's look at what you can do to start reducing the occurrences of these 4 behaviors if you notice them coming up. So this Listen, Summarize, Validate tool, I really like. It's sort of similar to the Identify, Accept, Validate tool that you're using on yourself, but it works in communicating with your partner, and it helps neutralize all of those 4 horsemen, particularly defensiveness. So there are probably times when you don't feel understood by your partner, and they may never really be able to understand. I mean, who could understand what we're going through unless they've been in our shoes, really? And you may not understand your partner either. how could you if you hadn't been in their shoes, being in a relationship with someone who has a chronic illness? The cycle where both partners don't feel understood often leads to each of you trying to drill into the other person what you want understood. Meanwhile, no one's listening because you're too busy trying to be heard. And it can be really hard to hear how your partner feels, but them having a hard time with your condition doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to leave. This listen, summarize, validate is a nice way to acknowledge your partner and acknowledge that this is not what they signed up for either. We're going to start by taking initiative and showing them listening and understanding first. Once your partner feels heard and understood, this is going to open up space for them to do the same for you. They're going to be more willing to listen once they feel that they've been heard. So let's look at this listen, summarize, validate tool. And I'm going to use another scenario. Let's say I can't go out much. My partner and I made plans to go to a concert months ago. And we've really been looking forward to this for months. We're so excited. And the day of the concert arrives, and I'm not up for it. I'm not well enough to go. I'm out of my energy envelope, and I have to cancel. And my partner is upset. And he is saying, you always cancel. We can never do anything together anymore. This is so frustrating. My first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to listen. I'm going to listen to my partner without interrupting. And I'm going to try and take it all in as if I'm observing in a lab almost. I want to notice the body language, emotions, tone of voice, maybe his face is getting red. Is he, pacing, or what is he doing with his hands? I'm just going to take in the whole picture. And I'm going to listen in a way where I'm not waiting for him to stop talking so I can jump in. And I'm not waiting for him to say something specific so that I can latch onto that and address that. I just want to let him say what he needs to say. The next step is to summarize what I heard him say, just the facts. And I'm going to also note any emotions they seem to be feeling. So if I'm summarizing what my partner said to me, I might say, yeah, I get it. We booked this concert months ago, and there are times when I've had to cancel, and it is really frustrating and disappointing. I get it. Sorry, that's not just the summary. The summary is, yes, we booked this months ago. We've both been looking forward to it, and I've had to cancel, and you're feeling frustrated. Here's the validate that I got a little ahead of myself with. Then we're going to validate how your partner's feeling, their emotions. Again, this doesn't mean you're agreeing with what they said or that you approve of it. You're simply validating them in the context of their own life and beliefs. Just like when we validated ourselves, we're validating it in the context of their life, not our life. We're saying, yeah, it makes sense you're feeling frustrated given that I had to cancel at the last moment and you were looking forward to this. Context of their life. In the context of our life, it's a little different, but in their life, we need to validate them in that way. And this is a really wonderful technique to help your partner feel understood and validated. It's also a good tool for your partner to practice too, if they're on board with that, if you can share it with them. But if they aren't willing, just keep working on it yourself and pay attention to the way they change their response to you. It is pretty interesting to sort of experiment with this with other people. I find people respond really well to being heard. And the summary sort of reinforces that you've really understood what they've said. It gives them a chance to clarify any misunderstandings. And then the validation helps, it's soothing, right? It's a regulator. So this is a really great tool that I love. And again, you can also ask questions to clarify if there's something you don't understand. When you're summarizing, that usually comes up around the summary, when you're trying to understand exactly what they mean. And so after you've used the listen, summarize, validate, and your partner is more willing to listen, it's time to share your own feelings and thoughts and make requests and asks for your needs to be met. Your partner is going to be a lot more open to this once they feel that they've been heard and understood. So what I call the feedback formula, this is a great tool for reducing criticisms and defensiveness, two of the horsemen of the apocalypse. And this is the main practice of a model called nonviolent communication. It's a great model for communication, and I use it all the time in both my practice and my personal life. So let's take a closer look at that. Maybe you've already seen something like this before or come across something like this. So let's take a look at it. It's got 4 parts. And the first part, we want to describe the behavior that's bothering us. So, and we want it to be as though if a camera was filming it and a third party came along, they could say, yes, that happened. So we want to avoid words like always, never. We want to avoid characterizations like lazy or mean. We want it to be the facts. So in this case, I might say, when you said, I always cancel plans at the last minute, because my partner said to me, you always cancel plans at the last minute. And that really hurt. So I'm going to use that as the basis of this feedback formula example. The next step is I feel, and you list 1 to 2 emotions. We want to keep this really simple. So for example, I felt guilty and sad. And then we're going to list our needs. What do I need? Like, what is it that's leading me to feel this way? Well, I need to feel understood, accepted, and connected. And so I'm going to say, yeah, when you said, I always cancel plans at the last minute, I feel guilty and sad because I need understanding, acceptance, and connection. And the last step is to make our request. This is an invitation. Our partner can say yes or no, but it's our opportunity to ask for our need to be met. And here I might say, would you be willing to make a backup plan next time so that if I have to cancel, you have an alternative? You have someone else who might go in my place. The key I will say here is the wording is really important. It's really tempting to put you make me after the behavior. When you say X, Y, Z, you make me feel, we want to avoid that you make me and just say, I feel. And then the request, would you be willing to? That wording is really key as well. It's more empowering for the person to answer that with would you be willing to instead of, oh, can you, for example. Use this formula for one issue at a time and break larger issues down into small, manageable pieces. Your partner can't read your mind or know what your needs are all the time. So this is a kind way to communicate things. Use it regularly to communicate complaints so you don't end up holding them all in until you explode. When you do this, complaints tend to come out as criticisms if you hold them in for too long. And as we know, those of us who tend towards people-pleasing, we hold in our complaints until we just can't hold them in anymore. And this is also a great tool to share with your partner if they're willing to use it. Nonviolent communication leads to a greater understanding of each other, and it leads to more empathy and compassion in the relationship and strengthens it. And it also gives your partner a chance to state their needs in a way that you might be able to hear them more easily. Our partner's needs do become overshadowed by illness sometimes. So this could be really helpful in that regard. If you're interested in this nonviolent communication, I really recommend really any resources, but the book Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg, it's in the resource list, and it's not a thick book, and it gives you a lot more detail and examples and explains the theory behind this style. I'm also providing a handout with the feedback formula on it, as well attached to that a list of emotions and a list of needs, because sometimes it can be hard to figure those out on your own if it's not something you're used to doing. And it can be helpful just to look at a list and see if you can choose the ones that apply to you. Okay, so this brings us to the end of the communication tools I'm sharing. And out of fairness, these are new techniques. And I always like to say, if you're trying one and it feels weird or if it feels awkward, you're doing it right. This is something that's new and it's not going to feel natural right away. Okay. And now we're going to look at regulating the nervous system and emotions and why this is important. So we're going to be talking about the nervous system, specifically the autonomic nervous system, which is part of the peripheral nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system regulates involuntary processes in the body, like breathing, digestion, blood pressure, and heart rate. And our autonomic nervous system, which might already be a bit haywire, or quite a bit haywire from dealing with chronic pain and illness, becomes even more activated during conflict, which results then in fight, flight, or freeze response that you may have heard of before. So this makes communication with your partner, or anyone else for that matter, more difficult. So let's just take a closer look at the different states here. So starting with the parasympathetic nervous system, and I like to have this range of numbering so that you can sort of assess yourself from time to time and say, where am I on this scale? So in the 4 to 6 range, this nice middle place, that's when the parasympathetic nervous system is engaged. And in polyvagal theory, that's referred to as the ventral vagal state, the rest and digest, where you feel grounded, or you feel calm, maybe the way you feel after a yoga class or a meditation. And this is where we best socially engage. Our social engagement system is activated. It's easy to connect with other people in this state. If we go up to the 7 to 10 state, this is that fight or flight state where our nervous system's saying, there's a threat to my life and I need to run or I need to fight. We call this state of dysregulation hyperarousal. And that might feel like a fast heart rate, shallow breathing. You might feel lightheaded, sweaty palms. That's where that anxiety really kicks in. And then if we look at the lower section, in the parasympathetic again, but the dorsal vagal state, this is that freeze response where if we can't run and fight, we play dead. We're the mouse playing dead so it doesn't get eaten. That might look like being checked out, dissociating, or even getting sleepy. Whenever my dad used to get really stressed, he would sleep. He would sleep and sleep and sleep and sleep. And I would always be so envious because I'd be up at the 8 or 9 end of the scale when I was stressed, and he'd meanwhile be snoring away on the couch. So different people respond differently. And then finally, the fawn response, which is not part of polyvagal theory, but I wanted to include because it involves people pleasing. And it involves people pleasing to a degree that you disconnect from your own emotions, sensations, and needs. So it's a blended state between the two parasympathetic states where there's an over-reliance on that social engagement system. So you're hyper vigilant about other people's emotions and behaviors. But it's also combined with that shutdown response. So you're shutting down your own emotions in order to please others. And essentially here you're sacrificing yourself for others' happiness when you're in the fawn response. And the reason this nervous system scale is important when it comes to relationships is this. So when you're in fight, flight, or freeze, how clearly or logically are you thinking? Not very, because we don't need to think logically and thoughtfully when we're running from the bear or fighting the bear. And that's because thinking is not needed. Yeah, we don't need to think when we're playing dead either. These systems work well when there is a life threat. They work very well. But when our brain perceives conflict, say conflict with our partner as a life threat, then this response no longer becomes helpful. And that's not a conscious interpretation. That's our limbic brain interpreting that. We need to be in a grounded state. We need to be in that 4 to 6 range in order to take care of ourselves and engage in effective communication. We need that social engagement system to be turned on. So all of those tools that I've already shared with you are not going to work nearly as well, if at all, if you're above a 6 or below a 4. The more time we spend in that 4 to 6 place, the better both of our relationship, the better for our relationship, our emotional regulation, and our physical symptoms. I always find that my physical symptoms are least strong when I'm in that 4 to 6 range. And this is not easy. It's going to take practice. Conflict and strong, uncomfortable emotions, which we don't know how to soothe, will dysregulate us. Your job will be to build the muscle that helps you tolerate the tension in your relationship and to start practicing self-soothing and bringing yourself back to that 4 to 6 range over and over again. So you become an expert at bringing yourself back to that 4 to 6 state. The goal is to be able to have ongoing conversations about the hard stuff, truly listening to your partner and understanding and being curious about them without reacting to what they're saying or taking it personally. So hard not to take it personally. And this includes learning to tolerate the tension of knowing that your partner has to deal with your illness as well, without going into the fawn response, which so many of us tend to do. So we know now that we want to keep coming back to that 4 to 6 range. How do we do it? Well, I'm going to give you a few ideas. Deep breathing with longer out breaths than in breaths, particularly combined with movement. So for example, inhaling and raising your arms, exhaling and allowing them to drop, or slowly bring them down. Self-compassion, again, that statement, out of fairness, this is hard. It's very regulating self-compassion. Talk to and encourage yourself like you would your best friend. Cuddle a pet, take a warm bath or shower, or just soak your feet if you're not able to. Listen to relaxing music. Identify and notice negative thoughts and work with them with cognitive behavior therapy. And participate in a brain rewiring program like DNRS or Gupta, which both work very well to bring you back to that middle place. Practice this self-soothing regularly and not just when things are difficult, because this will make it easier to use those skills in the harder moments. When approaching difficult conversations with your partner, only start that conversation when you're in the 4 to 6 range. And if your nervous system is going out of this range and you can feel it, take a break and come back to the conversation after you regulate and soothe yourself and bring yourself back to that middle place. But always make sure to make a plan for coming back to the conversation. This might break up conversations into really small segments at first, and that's okay, because it's needed until you've built up more of that tension tolerating muscle and your ability to self-soothe. Slowing down and taking care of yourself is key. You just want to slow down. You don't need to fix everything all at once, and you can't. And then finally, let's look at the last piece of the relationship work that I'm covering today, strengthening your friendship and bond. So I'm just going to provide a variety of ideas, again, part of the buffet I'm offering. We can often get into the cycle of unmet needs and unappreciated effort, where no one feels taken care of or appreciated, and this leads to unhappiness, resentment, anger, and frustration. And stable and happy couples share more positive feelings and actions than negative ones. And there's a magic ratio here identified by John Gottman, who I've mentioned a few times. The magic ratio is 5 to 1, and this means that for every 1 negative feeling or interaction between partners, there needs to be 5 positive feelings or interactions. And that might be something like showing appreciation and saying, thank you, I really appreciate what you did, even if you don't feel like saying it and you're feeling kind of grumpy. You're just doing it. Showing respect and appreciation is key. And if you're familiar with the love languages, you can start to incorporate some of the love languages in the way you're expressing the positive feelings or interactions. I've also referenced the love language resource on the handout I'm giving. Continue investing in your friendship and what connects you. What are your shared interests and activities? Make time for date nights, physical intimacy when possible, and conversation. Continue with the same things that helped you connect pre-illness. What is it that drew you to this person? Focus on the things that you can do together and what you do bring to the relationship, rather than focusing on what's no longer possible or what you can't do. And this might also include creating new shared activities. Make space for fun and laughter together. Humor can be so helpful when it comes to coping. It's a great stress reliever. I have a client who, when she's well enough, she will mop the kitchen floor. And whenever she mops the kitchen floor, she mops the floor topless. And she and her husband get a real good laugh out of that. Limit health discussions to certain windows of time. So unless it's an emergency, this way illness isn't the main focus in the relationship, and you can go about life without constantly having this discussion present. Find a new shared language in which to discuss the illness, and this kind of ties into number 5. This way you don't get into details, descriptions, and specifics. For example, in DNRS, we refer to symptoms as it or its. So I might say to my partner, I'm having a day with a lot of its today. And that's our shared language where he knows, yeah, it's not a great day. And I don't have to elaborate. I don't have to go into the details. He knows it's not a great day. And that's all that needs to be said. And then we can move on from there. We just want to avoid talking about symptoms too much so they don't overshadow other aspects of the relationship. Make backup plans, can't speak. Make backup plans in case of unpredictability. Encourage your partner to take care of themselves. This means eating enough, sleeping enough, getting movement or exercise. That they have outside interests, they're getting health care, have a social life, and they're taking time and space for themselves. We really need to encourage our partners to make connections and be social so they're not ending up isolated. It's really important for both of you to have outside support and not just rely on each other. Don't let your partner be your primary caretaker. We want to be aware of stress on our partner as a caregiver, and chronic illness, can lead to caregiver burnout. It's a hard truth. Of course you want your partner to take care of you, but for healthy dynamics in your relationship, we want to try not to let them be our primary caregiver. We want to spread around the help. It can be tricky, but allowing your partner to be your primary caregiver can lead to codependence, resentment. Sometimes it is unavoidable, and then all the other tools become more important, but if possible, keeping this in mind. Be willing to put yourself in their shoes. This can be really hard if you feel your partner isn't doing the same for you, and it can be tempting to one-up their struggle. Because let's face it, our struggle is hard. It can be really uncomfortable too to acknowledge that our illness impacts our partner, but it will be very validating to them. And if they love you, it's not comfortable for them to see you go through this pain, discomfort, unhappiness. They want you to feel good. And your partner may not know how to handle all of the emotions they're having around this new situation. And you acknowledging that can be powerful. Also, having an understanding of your partner's past difficult experiences and traumas and the resulting triggers can help you identify when they're reacting based on their past experiences and not take those reactions on yourself. We can then have compassion for our partner, but not get hijacked or dragged into their emotions or reactions. Allow yourselves to grieve, both of you. You've both had a loss. Fight fairly. I've attached a handout on fighting fairly. It's just some do's and don'ts that you can post on your fridge. Slow down. I mentioned this before, but really slowing down. Be intentional with the tools and keep slowing down. Conversations can move fast, and you may feel you get caught up in the current of it. So bring yourself back to that 4 to 6 range, that middle place. Slow down, apply the tools. If you do something different, you're going to get a different result. And while you can't control your partner or do their share of the work, you can make a difference on your own. If your partner is on board with what I've shared, wonderful. The two of you working together on this is ideal. However, at the end of the day, some people just can't cope with others' pain and illness and the resulting emotions. And if this is your partner, this would be a time for radical acceptance and lots of self-compassion. Which brings me to my last slide. When to see a couples counselor. There are many reasons couples might choose to see a counselor together, but in the context of pain and illness, here are a few potential examples. So you're having the same fight over and over again with no resolution, especially over issues of caretaking or your illness. If you're avoiding difficult conversations about your health condition, if you're frequently encountering the 4 horsemen behaviors that I mentioned earlier, criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. If your condition is taking up all of your energy and you feel too overwhelmed to even know where to start. If you want to end the relationship but don't have the strength or ability to do it on your own. My final note is I highly recommend working with a counselor who's trained in the developmental model of couples counseling. This is a really powerful therapy that really focuses on that being able to stay regulated in conversations and to stay in that 4 to 6 range. However, couples counseling can get really pricey, So if cost is an issue, you can look into counselors with sliding scale rates, newer counselors such as master's students doing their practicums, or any other programs and services that you might be eligible for. I've included a list of low cost couples counseling options in the resources I'm providing. You know, it can be tempting to wait and see if things are going to get better, or think if it gets any worse, then we'll go. But I really encourage you not to wait, to address the problems as soon as possible, whether on your own or with a counselor, because the longer you wait, the harder it will be to repair. So as we're approaching the end of the presentation here, let's take a look at what we've covered. We've gone from this mind map with all the messiness and struggle of being human in this situation, and we've created a plan on how to approach it. Sort of created an organizational plan here. I know this is a lot of work. This is a lot of information today. I know I've really packed it in, and it's a lot of work just surviving day to day. But you have an outline now of some ideas, and please don't try to do it all at once or think that you need to do all of it ever. Remember, it's a buffet. Pick something that seems reasonable to start with and applicable to you. Try one thing, try another, stick with your favorites. And remember, out of fairness, this is hard. And that brings us to the end of the presentation.